The snow didn't freeze her heart. The cruel words of her fated mate did. Cast out into a deadly medieval blizzard, a rejected Omega was meant to perish alone. But when a hauntingly beautiful silver wolf's howl cut through the biting wind, she didn't find death. She found the king. The great hall of the Ashenvale pack was suffocatingly warm, filled with the scent of roasted venison, spilled ale, and the nervous sweat of 300 wolves. Yet, standing in the center of the ancient, rune-carved stone floor, Isla Rowe felt as though she were already buried beneath the winter ice. She was an Omega, in the brutal hierarchy of the medieval werewolf territories that made her little more than a servant, a peacekeeper meant to tend the pups and soothe the aggressive tempers of the warriors. But the goddess had played a cruel trick on her. Upon her 18th birthday, the scent of pine and crisp winter air had overwhelmed her senses, leading her directly to the high table, to Cedric Hastings, the new Alpha of Ashenvale. For 3 weeks, they had kept it a secret. Cedric had visited her in the shadowy corners of the keep, whispering sweet promises, claiming that they would rewrite the ancient laws together. But a pack on the brink of war needed strong alliances, not a sickly, low-born Omega whose father, Thomas Rowe, had died a disgraced debtor. Tonight was the winter solstice, the night the Alpha was to officially take his Luna. Isla of House Rowe, Cedric's voice echoed against the vaulted ceiling. He stood tall, clad in a heavy cloak of dire bear fur, his golden eyes cold and unyielding. Beside him stood Genevieve, a high-ranking alpha female from the wealthy neighboring Riverstone territory. She wore a dress of crimson velvet, a triumphant smirk playing on her painted lips. "Step forward," Cedric commanded. Isla's legs trembled, but she forced herself to walk. The crowd parted. She saw the faces of the people she had grown up with. Henry Fletcher, the blacksmith who used to sneak her honeyed apples, looked firmly at his boots. Old Agnes, the village weaver, openly wept but dared not speak. They all knew what was coming. Real life in the pack was not a fairy tale. It was politics, survival, and blood. "Cedric, please," Isla whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackling hearth. "You promised." "I promised to do what is best for Ashenvale," Cedric replied, his voice devoid of the warmth she had known. He raised his hand, silencing the murmurs of the hall. "Our lands are starved. The northern borders are plagued by rogues. I need a Luna who can lead armies, not one who cowers at the sound of a drawn sword." He took a deep breath, the muscles in his jaw ticking. "I, Cedric Hastings, Alpha of Ashenvale, reject you, Isla Rowe, as my fated mate and Luna." The words were an executioner's axe. The severing of a fated mate bond was not just emotional, it was violently physical. Isla gasped as a sensation like molten iron tore through her chest. Her inner wolf shrieked in agony, thrashing against the confines of her soul. She collapsed to the cold stone floor, clutching her heart as black veins temporarily surfaced along her pale neck. She choked on her own breath, a raw, ragged sob tearing from her throat. Genevieve leaned over, her voice a poisonous purr. "Take the trash out, guards. She is a distraction the Alpha no longer needs." Cedric didn't even look down. By the ancient laws of the solstice, a rejected mate cannot remain within the territory of the Alpha who severed the bond. She is exiled, effective immediately. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Outside, the worst blizzard in a century, the Great Freeze of 1452, they would later call it, was raging. Snowdrifts were already waist-high. To exile an Omega with no supplies in this weather was a death sentence. It was murder, thinly veiled as tradition. "Alpha, my lord, please!" cried old Agnes, stepping forward. "She will freeze before she reaches the tree line." "Silence!" Cedric roared, his alpha aura flaring, forcing the entire room into submission. Isla, already weakened by the broken bond, was pressed flat against the stones by the sheer weight of his command. "Garrett, escort her out. If she returns, she is to be killed on sight." Garrett, a massive brute of a guard who had always despised Isla's gentle nature, grabbed her roughly by the arm. He dragged her across the hall, Isla's vision blurred with tears and pain. She couldn't fight back. Her wolf was entirely broken, curled into a silent, dying ball within her mind. The heavy oak doors of the keep were hauled open. The screaming wind instantly invaded the hall, extinguishing the nearest torches. Garrett shoved her out into the blinding white fury. "Start walking, Omega," he sneered, before the doors slammed shut behind her. The heavy thud of the iron lock turning was the final sound she heard from her home. Isla stood in the courtyard, clad only in her simple, rough-spun woolen dress and a thin gray cloak. The cold was a physical entity, biting into her exposed skin with 1,000 microscopic teeth. The sky was an abyss of swirling white and gray. With nowhere to go and her heart bleeding from an invisible, fatal wound, Isla pulled her cloak tight and began to walk toward the treacherous Frost Peak Mountains. If she was going to die, she refused to let Cedric have the satisfaction of finding her frozen body on his doorstep. Time lost all meaning in the howling dark of the blizzard. Isla forced one foot in front of the other, wading through snow that was now chest-deep in places. Her hands and feet had long since passed the point of burning. They were completely numb, heavy blocks of ice attached to her failing body. Her mind began to play tricks on her. She saw phantom lights in the trees, heard the laughter of her late mother in the whistling wind. "Just lie down, Isla," a seductive, sleepy voice whispered in her mind. "Lie down in the snow. It's so soft. It will be warm soon." She stumbled over a hidden root and crashed hard into a snowbank. She lacked the strength to push herself back up. The frost rested heavily on her dark eyelashes, sealing her eyes shut. The pain of her broken bond was finally fading, replaced by the deep, lethal lethargy of hypothermia. This was it, the end of Isla Rowe, a discarded mistake. Then, a sound cut through the storm. It was a howl, but it was not the panicked, high-pitched cry of a hungry woodland wolf. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated power, deep, resonant, and vibrating, with an ancient majesty that seemed to make the very snowflakes pause in the air. The howl was laden with fury, but beneath it, Isla's sensitive Omega hearing detected a thread of agonizing pain. Her inner wolf, which had been comatose since the rejection, twitched. Omegas were inherently healers, nurturers. Their instincts were driven by the need to comfort, to mend. The sheer distress in that powerful howl bypassed Isla's dying conscious mind and struck a primal chord in her soul. "Someone is hurt," her wolf whimpered, forcing a spark of adrenaline into her freezing veins. "Get up." Isla forced her eyes open, shattering the ice on her lashes. She dragged herself upward, leaning heavily against the rough bark of an ancient pine. She listened. Another snarl echoed through the trees, closer this time, followed by the sickening crunch of bone and a wet yelp. Driven by an instinct she couldn't control, Isla trudged toward the sound. She crested a small, rocky ridge and looked down into a clearing sheltered by massive, snow-laden evergreens. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. In the center of the clearing stood a wolf, unlike any she had ever seen in her lifetime. He was massive, easily the size of a warhorse, with a coat of pure, shimmering silver that seemed to glow against the darkness of the woods. But the magnificent beast was staggering. A thick, black-fletched arrow was buried deep in his left shoulder, the blood staining his pristine silver fur, a stark, horrifying crimson. Surrounding him were 4 monstrous, mangy wolves, rogues. They were the vicious, packless killers that plagued the borders. They circled the silver wolf with a coordinated military precision that rogues rarely possessed. This wasn't a random attack. This was an assassination attempt. The silver wolf lunged, his jaws snapping shut on the neck of the nearest rogue with a brutal crack. But the effort cost him. His injured leg gave out, and he crashed into the snow. The remaining 3 rogues instantly swarmed him, tearing at his flanks. Isla should have run. She was a weak, weaponless Omega. But seeing the majestic creature being torn apart ignited a strange, desperate fire in her hollow chest. She looked down and saw a thick, jagged branch of ironwood half buried in the snow. Without thinking, Isla grabbed the heavy branch. She didn't shout she knew better than to draw their attention prematurely. She slid down the snowy embankment, her silent, light Omega footfalls masked by the howling wind. She approached the largest rogue from behind just as it reared back to tear into the silver wolf's throat. With a scream that tore her frost-bitten throat, Isla swung the ironwood branch with all the meager strength she possessed. The jagged wood connected violently with the rogue's skull. The beast yelped, thrown off balance, turning its furious yellow eyes onto Isla. It was a fatal mistake for the rogue. The momentary distraction was all the silver wolf needed. Despite his grievous wounds, the silver giant surged upward. His massive jaws clamped down on the distracted rogue's spine, ending its life instantly. Seeing their leader fall so brutally, and unsure of how many reinforcements were in the shadows, the last two rogues scrambled backward, tucking their tails, and vanished into the blinding blizzard. Silence descended on the clearing, save for the wind and the heavy, wet breathing of the silver wolf. Isla dropped the branch, her hands shaking violently, suddenly realizing the sheer insanity of what she had just done. The silver wolf turned his massive head slowly toward her. His eyes were not the standard gold or amber of common alphas. They were a striking, piercing, metallic silver. They locked onto hers, holding an intelligence and a regal intensity that made her instinctively want to bare her neck in submission. Instead, she watched as the ferocious light in his eyes dimmed. The silver wolf swayed, let out a low, rumbling groan, and collapsed entirely onto the blood-soaked snow. "No, no, no," Isla muttered, rushing forward and falling to her knees beside his massive head. Up close, the heat radiating from him was incredible, like a blazing hearth. She examined the arrow. The black fletching was a signature of the king's royal guard, a detail Isla wouldn't fully understand until much later. Right now, she only smelled the sickly sweet scent of wolfsbane coating the iron arrowhead. It was poisoning him. "I have to pull it out," she whispered to the beast, hoping he could understand her. "It's going to hurt." The wolf's massive silver eyes cracked open. He let out a soft huff, pushing his wet nose gently against her freezing palm. The contact sent a bizarre electric shock up Ila's arm. It wasn't the fiery, overwhelming pull of a fated mate bond like she had felt with Cedric, but rather a deep, resonant hum, a profound sense of safety and rightness. Gritting her teeth, Isla gripped the slick, bloody shaft of the arrow. 1, 2, 3, she yanked. The wolf threw his head back in a silent howl of agony, his massive body thrashing. Blood welled from the wound. Isla immediately tore the heavy fabric of her skirt, pressing the woolen wadding hard against the injury to staunch the bleeding. "Hold on," she pleaded, tears freezing on her cheeks. She looked around frantically. Through the veil of falling snow, she spotted the dark, gaping maw of a cave nestled beneath a rocky overhang nearby. "We need to get out of the wind. Come on, please. You have to help me." Miraculously, as if commanded by her desperate plea, the great silver beast forced himself up onto 3 legs. Leaning his massive weight against her frail, shivering form, they limped agonizingly toward the cave. Every step was torture. Isla's muscles screamed, and the wolf's blood soaked through her thin dress, but the hot blood ironically kept her core from freezing entirely. They collapsed together inside the dry, dark sanctuary of the cavern. The wind howled furiously outside, furious that it had been denied its prey. Isla curled herself against the broad, muscular expanse of the silver wolf's chest. She was exhausted, dying of cold, and utterly broken-hearted. But as the massive beast wrapped his thick, furred tail around her trembling body, pulling her closer to his overwhelming heat, she felt something strange. Peace. She drifted off to sleep, to the rhythmic, powerful thumping of the silver wolf's heart, completely unaware that she was wrapped in the arms of Dominic, the Alpha King of the Unified Territories, who had just been betrayed by his own court. And Dominic, fading into unconsciousness, knew only one thing: the scent of wild mountain flowers, radiating from the small, brave creature in his arms, was the only thing tethering him to life. The biting wind had finally exhausted its fury. Morning light, sharp and blindingly white, pierced through the frost-rimmed entrance of the cavern. Isla woke not to the freezing bite of death, but to an overwhelming, radiating heat. She opened her eyes, her mind thick with the grogginess of near hypothermia. The massive expanse of silver fur she had fallen asleep against was gone. Instead, her cheek was resting against a broad, heavily scarred, and distinctly human chest. Isla gasped, scrambling backward and hitting the rough stone wall of the cave. Sitting across from her, illuminated by the harsh winter sun, was a man. He was breathtakingly imposing, built with the heavy, corded muscle of a seasoned warrior. His hair was a stark, bright silver that fell to his broad shoulders, and a thick woolen blanket, which Isla vaguely recognized as her own torn cloak, somehow draped over his waist, preserved his modesty. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. They were the exact piercing metallic silver of the giant wolf. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in her chest, holding the same resonant power as the howl that had drawn her through the storm. You were the wolf," Isla stammered, her hands instinctively coming up to her chest. The man offered a tight, grimacing smile, his left hand clutching his heavily bandaged shoulder where the black-fletched arrow had struck. "And you are the remarkably foolish Omega who fights off armed rogues with a rotting tree branch. I am Dominic." Isla swallowed hard. "I'm Isla Rowe." "Well, Isla Rowe," Dominic said, leaning his head back against the stone, a sheen of sweat on his forehead indicating the wolfsbane was still fighting his accelerated healing. "You saved my life. I owe you a life debt. But first, you need to tell me why a delicate Omega was wandering the Frost Peak Mountains during the Great Freeze without an escort." The blunt candor of his question pierced her fragile defenses. The memory of the Great Hall, of Cedric's cold golden eyes, and the agonizing physical tear of the rejection flooded back. Isla looked down at her bruised, frostbitten hands. "I was rejected," she whispered, the shame tasting like ash in her mouth. "Cedric Hastings, the Alpha of Ashenvale. We were fated, but he needed a political alliance with Riverstone. He severed the bond and exiled me. His guards threw me out into the blizzard." Silence stretched in the cave, thick and heavy. When Isla finally looked up, Dominic's metallic eyes were blazing with an unholy, terrifying fury. His chest heaved, and the temperature in the cave seemed to spike. "He exiled a fated mate into a storm?" Dominic's voice was a lethal whisper. "He threw away an Omega? The old laws dictate that Omegas are the heart of a pack, the rarest and most revered. Any alpha who abuses one is unfit to lead." "The old laws don't matter in Ashenvale anymore," Isla said bitterly. "Real life is about power, land, and survival." "Real life," Dominic growled, pushing himself up to a seated position, his imposing frame dominating the small space, "is about to catch up with Cedric Hastings." Dominic did not tell her his surname, nor did he reveal that he was king of the unified territories. He needed time to heal, and more importantly, he needed to understand the depth of the treason within his own court. The assassination attempt the night before was not random. The black-fletched arrow belonged to his own royal vanguard. General Arthur Pendleton, his most trusted military advisor, was the only man who knew his travel route through the Frost Peak Pass. Arthur had orchestrated the hit, utilizing rogues to ensure the king's death looked like a tragic border skirmish. But as the days turned into a brutal, freezing week of survival, politics faded into the background. Trapped in the cavern, relying on Isla's inherent knowledge of mountain herbs to draw the poison from his shoulder, an undeniable shift occurred. Isla's inner wolf, deeply scarred and thought to be dead from Cedric's rejection, began to stir. It didn't wake with the violent, burning desperation of her first bond. It woke slowly, bathed in the quiet strength and protective warmth of the silver-haired warrior. One evening, while roasting a snow hare Dominic had caught, their fingers brushed over the fire. A jolt of pure, golden electricity shot up Isla's arm. She gasped, dropping the skewer. Dominic froze, his silver eyes locking onto hers, dilated and breathless. The scent of pine and fresh snow that had defined her first bond was completely gone. In its place, filling Dominic's senses, was the intoxicating aroma of wild mountain flowers and rain, the scent of his own soul, mirrored in hers. It was a second-chance bond, an anomaly in werewolf lore granted by the goddess only to those who had been unjustly broken, pairing them not with a biological match, but with an absolute, destined equal. "Isla," Dominic rumbled, his voice thick with sudden reverence. He reached across the fire, taking her small, scarred hand in his massive, rough one. He didn't demand or claim. He simply brought her knuckles to his lips. You are not broken. You were simply being saved from me. For the first time since the night she was thrown into the snow, the ice around Isla's heart shattered entirely. 4 weeks later, the great freeze finally began to thaw, leaving behind a landscape of crystalline beauty and treacherous mud. In the great hall of Ashenvale, the fires roared, casting dancing shadows over a grand feast. Cedric Hastings sat at the high table, a goblet of imported wine in his hand, looking immensely satisfied. Genevieve sat beside him, adorned in stolen silks. Across from them sat a guest of supreme importance, General Arthur Pendleton of the Royal Vanguard, flanked by a dozen heavily armed guards. "It is a tragedy, Alpha Hastings, a true tragedy," General Pendleton said smoothly, cutting into a thick piece of roasted boar. "King Dominic has been missing for over a month. The royal trackers found only blood and the carcasses of rogues in the Frost Peak Pass. We must assume the worst." "A heavy blow to the kingdom," Cedric replied, feigning sorrow while a greedy glint sparked in his golden eyes. "But the territories must have leadership." "Indeed," Pendleton smiled thinly. "The High Council is preparing to name a regent. With your pack's strategic position and your new alliance with Riverstone, I believe Ashenvale would make an excellent seat for my wardenship of the North once I take the throne." Cedric raised his glass. "To the future, General." Boom. The heavy oak doors of the keep, the very doors Isla had been dragged through weeks prior, exploded inward with the force of a battering ram. The heavy iron hinges shrieked and snapped, sending the massive wooden slabs crashing onto the stone floor. 300 wolves leaped to their feet, snarling, drawing steel. Standing in the archway, framed by the pale winter sunlight, was a man who seemed to swallow the light around him. Dominic stood tall, draped in a heavy cloak of black bear fur, his silver hair catching the wind. But it was his aura that paralyzed the room. It was not merely the aura of an alpha. It was the crushing, suffocating, absolute command of the king. Every wolf in the room, from the lowest Omega to the strongest warrior, was physically forced to their knees by the sheer, invisible weight of his presence. Even Cedric, gasping for air, collapsed against the high table, his legs giving out. General Pendleton dropped his knife, his face draining of all color. "General Pendleton," Dominic's voice boomed, echoing off the rafters like thunder. "You look remarkably healthy for a man mourning his king." "My king," Pendleton stammered, falling to his knees, his mind racing to formulate a lie. We thought you dead." "You made sure I was dead," Dominic corrected, his silver eyes flashing with deadly intent. He stepped into the hall. And then, from behind his massive frame, stepped a second figure. The hall let out a collective gasp. It was Isla Rowe. But she was unrecognizable from the frail, broken girl who had been cast out into the blizzard. She wore a tailored tunic of deep forest green, her posture straight, her chin held high. The sickliness that had plagued her was gone, replaced by a radiant, terrifying vitality. She glowed with the power of the bond she shared with the king. She was not just an Omega, she was the Luna Queen. Cedric's eyes widened in absolute horror. "Isla? No, that's impossible. You died." "I survived, Cedric," Isla said, her voice clear and unwavering, carrying across the silent hall. "No thanks to you." Dominic stepped forward, his gaze locked on the treacherous general. "Arthur Pendleton, for the crime of high treason, for conspiring with rogues, and for the attempted assassination of your king, I sentence you to death." Before Pendleton could even reach for his sword, Dominic moved with supernatural speed. His hand shot out, clamping around the general's throat. With a brutal, effortless twist, a sickening snap echoed through the silent hall. The general fell lifeless to the floor. The royal guards, realizing their commander was a traitor and their king was alive, immediately dropped their weapons and knelt, pressing their foreheads to the stone. Dominic turned his terrifying silver gaze upon Cedric Hastings. Cedric whimpered, trying to crawl backward over the high table, abandoning Genevieve, who sat frozen in terror. "Cedric of House Hastings," Dominic spoke, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "You broke the sacred old laws. You severed a fated bond for political gain. You exiled an innocent Omega into a deadly storm, condemning her to death. You are a coward, entirely unfit to lead a pack, let alone serve as a warden of my kingdom. Mercy, my king, please, Cedric begged, tears streaming down his face. I didn't know she was yours. I didn't know. She wasn't mine then, Dominic replied coldly. She was simply a citizen of my kingdom, and you failed her. Dominic raised his hand, the crushing weight of his king's aura localized entirely on Cedric. The Alpha of Ashenvale screamed as his inner wolf was forcibly suppressed, crushed into submission by the supreme ruler of their kind. I strip you of your rank, your lands, and your titles, Dominic declared. You are hereby exiled from Ashenvale and all unified territories. You will walk into the Frostpeak Mountains with nothing but the clothes on your back. If you survive, it is the goddess's will. If you return, you will be hunted. It was the exact sentence Cedric had handed down to Isla. Garrett, the guard who had dragged Isla out, stepped forward nervously, his eyes wide. My king, shall I escort him out? Dominic looked at Garrett with a gaze that promised immense pain if he ever stepped out of line again. See that you do, and if you handle him with an ounce of mercy, you will join him. As Cedric was dragged screaming from the hall, stripped of his furs and thrown into the freezing mud of the courtyard, Dominic turned back to the pack. He extended his hand to Isla. She stepped forward, placing her small hand in his. The moment their skin touched, a visible ripple of golden energy washed over the hall. The pack watched in awe as the rejected, forgotten Omega stood beside the Silver King, an equal in power, resilience, and grace. The blizzard had meant to bury her, and a traitor had meant to end a dynasty. Instead, the storm had simply cleared the path for the king to find his true queen. Did the twist of the rejected Omega becoming the supreme queen of the wolves leave you speechless? If you loved this tale of betrayal, survival, and ultimate revenge, hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love a fierce romantic drama, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic, jaw-dropping fantasy stories every week. Your support keeps the magic alive.